それでは
Thank you very much. Now I would like to invite all the speakers to come up to the stage to have some discussion all together. Those who attended the forum on day one have perhaps already heard a similar presentation, but those who are attending today for the first time in this forum, it was new for them. This question of design and the technology, which is really at the very cutting edge of the technology, the most advanced technologies, the relationship between the two is becoming really, really important. I think that was one of the background of this presentation I've just heard. So returning to the nature is one of the themes here, and I think there is a very, very subtle, unstable balance between the designing and creating versus natural environment. And Mr. Oron, Mr. Oron Katz, who was one of the keynote speakers on the day one, said, comparing the nature and the design by designing by using biotechnologies, in terms of the relationship between the two, can you make a comment?
I hope I understood you. It's interesting, usually I'm the provocateur, but I was actually really provoked by the title of Design Return to Nature, because the idea of nature is extremely problematic. Bruno Latour recently was talking about the fact that nature is a metaphysical, religious concept. You can't really have a rational discussion if you evoke nature, because nature is an irrational state, kind of concept that we constructed around the world around us. And it is becoming quite interesting in this context, because I don't know if we can have a rational discussion, especially after hearing you. It's an extremely evocative, complex, and emotional type of response that we need to deal with. So I would first, let me qualify it and say that I don't think that design would ever return to nature, first because nature doesn't exist, but secondly, because what we're doing and what we've seen just now is like the tour de force of the concept of nature. So we're not going to return to nature anytime soon unless there'll be some kind of a huge catastrophic disaster that would require us to actually engage in the most fundamental way with our survival without any aids of technological apparatuses. So yeah, that would be my first response.
自然っていうものはね。
When it comes to nature.
What is nature actually? Because nature is always changing. It's not static. So the species are changing and disappearing. In a sense, it is very delicate. It is on the balance, delicate balance. So it is the issue of environmental control as well. It is very difficult to control the environment. で、突然振りますが、ジェシカ about the environment in the architecture with bacteria,
So I'm a professor in the Institute of Ecology and Evolution at the University of Oregon, and for me, nature is very concrete and real, and it's because we spend time thinking about what makes ecological communities assemble. So what drives that process, and how do ecological communities change through time? And we're applying those principles to not only study biodiversity at the global scale, thinking about plants and animals, but also thinking about microorganisms in marine and terrestrial systems and in the built environment. So for me, nature is it's not abstract, it's concrete, because it's something that I spend a great deal of my time trying to understand from an ecology perspective.
the Kevin actually gave a talk about the bacteria on the surface of inside of the subway, and actually it's almost everywhere is contaminated by bacteria. That kind of things are really you cannot control, maybe, right? So it's going back to your first statement that the reality is so complex. What actually can we do for this complex reality?
So I think it's not a new, I mentioned this on the
Yeah.
first day, I don't think it's necessarily new, because if you look at urban planning, you can go all the way to Jane Jacobs if you want, who she talked a lot about in her book about the importance of the people, and in a way, architects may think that their city is contaminated with messy people that are unpredictable and damage their beautiful buildings. Or you look at the city from the perspective of the people. And I think the people is very difficult to design, right? I think that you kind of, and this is why, without debating whether we have nature or not, but I think that, you have to kind of assume that the system is very complex. And so I think that we have been doing it. I think good city planning, and planning is also, I think, a weird word, because you plan certain things, but most of the interesting things of cities are emergent. And I think you can, in retrospect, look at, like once I was in the committee with Kokudo Kotsusho about cultural capitals and cultural capital around the world, and you look at places like the Village in New York, or you look at, and most of those are not because they're on purpose. You have low rent, you have interesting adjacent spaces, the artists move in, and then the businesses move in, and usually you can't create those by investing. You create those by getting out of the way, and it's again very similar to cultures of bacteria, right? I think you create healthy bacteria by creating conditions for them to emerge, but it's an emergent process. So I think the word emergence, 日本語だと創発性,
It's
which the culture comes out. And there's certain levels of control. I think we talked about Roppongi Hills as being maybe on the higher end of control, but allowing the tenants and other people to emerge. But then you have other places like some of the cheaper places in Tokyo. I think you see more of them in New York. It's less planned.
Actually, don't you think that if you want to make a cultural district in the city, maybe you just eliminate all kind of rules?
I think you eliminate rules, and then you can be
make
like.
it free.
Remember last year there was the vice mayor from Paris, and he said that they just ignore the rules in Paris.
Yeah.
So I think there's different ways, but I think cost is very important. So I remember when they made Makari in Chiba.
Makahari, yeah.
Yeah, and they asked all of our startup companies to move to Makahari. And I checked the prices, and it was the same as downtown Akasaka. But there's no food, there's no culture, right? And because they invested too much money in the buildings, so it became expensive. So the cheap artists and the startups can't go, so the culture doesn't start. And so I think that in addition to rules, I think cost for most places is an important thing.
Yeah.
May I
Yes.
just return to a couple of points you made? And, can we have the first slide of my presentation? I want to show just the first slide, if possible, because I think that would touch on some of the issues. Some of you might know this guy. This is Craig Venter. He, in 2010, declared that he created the first synthetic life form, that one of his parents is a computer. And there's some Frankensteinian tendencies that we might go back towards. What's interesting with this organism, first of all, on a metaphorical statement, that was the Mycoplasma genitalia, which is basically a parasite that affects the male primates. So this is one thing just to keep in mind. It makes male primates scratch their genitals because of that, and that was the organism of choice for Craig Venter to make one of his parents a computer. So just as that story is, I think it's enough to make some statements. But
Oron.
what's interesting...
Speak slowly.
Okay, sorry.
Slowly.
What's interesting with him, he wrote a book which is called Life in the Speed of Light, and speaking fast, yeah. So, but in this book, he basically claims that there's nothing else to life beside DNA. And to some extent, Ito-san, you were kind of almost alluding to that, the DNA is the center of that. What Venter is talking about really is, from his perspective, the only important thing that exists is the information within the DNA. Now, one can claim that this is a very similar statement to a medieval idea of the eumaculus. And the idea of the eumaculus was that the male sperm is where the life is, where a small human lives, and then he inserts it into the woman, and it grows there. Now, this is what's referred to as DNA chauvinism. And to a large extent, what he's trying to tell us is that there's no context, that the only important thing is that information within that this set of instruction would operate. So, you know, I must admit that I found your presentation somewhat disturbing, because I think it's somewhat of a continuation of this DNA chauvinism that centers it. And here you see in his statement, he basically says that emergent behavior that comes outside of the DNA is what he referred to as neo-vitalism, and he actually sees it as a derogatory term. So how we, and as an artist, you know, really my interest is not so much what actually happens, but it's really the mindsets that drives our decisions in regard to the application of those kind of things. And you alluded again to the risk and the complex around it. But if you come up from a DNA chauvinist perspective, your sets of conclusion would be a very specific one, as opposed to opening it up towards the milieu and the context in which it operates. Just to finish this argument, there's actually even hereditary information which is not embedded in DNA. The membrane of the cell, there's no DNA code for the membrane of the cell. This is something that replicates independently, and it only comes from the female. So, you know, we need to start to think about life and how we're going to engineer life in a much less chauvinistic way in order for us to come up to conclusions that might result in you know, a better understanding of the complex system and the emergent behavior.
So I don't think we're disagreeing, and maybe part of it was lost in translation, but I think to me DNA is kind of like building architecture. It's the scaffold on top of which a lot is built, but I totally agree with you that you have, you know, epigenetics, which is the way the DNA is coded. You have the bacteria, you have viruses, you have membranes. And actually there's an interesting study that shows that sperm have olfactory sensors. They smell, right? And so why would a sperm need to smell the environment if it wasn't going to change its behavior depending on where it was going, you know? And so I think that it's very reductionist and incorrect to think that DNA is really more than just some basic building blocks on top of which we have all these other things. And I think just like and this is why I think the metaphor with the architect and the genetic engineer is similar in that it has a huge effect, and you can destroy things. But one other thing I think is important, and this was also by the same guy that works on CRISPR gene drive, is it's almost impossible to design a life form that will survive in the thing that you don't believe in, nature. Because the evolution is so strong and rigorous that anything that's human designed usually dies very quickly in nature. And the CRISPR gene drive only works because when it mates, even if it's weaker, the children will still be that, you know. And but I think you're right about Craig, and I think that that they overstate the strength of DNA.
For me, DNA looks like a set of information, not like architecture, but kind of information block. And then this is transferred from one generation to the next generation, right?
So the way to think, I think, about DNA is it's like a lot of little programs and data, but which ones get turned on and which ones operate are different depending on the environment and the person. But also, one thing that's very important is that it's not like architecture where you're. So one of my favorite examples is これ日本語の方がいいの？英語の方がいいの？英語でいいの？
どっちでも。
I'll do it in English and then.
僕は日本語の方が楽だけど。
じゃあ日本語に。
So then let me switch to Japanese. So the autism story, this connects to that. So the size of the brain is already determined because of the path that the child takes when she's born from the mother. It is soft, so it shrinks, and if it shrinks too much, it is said that the child turns autistic. But people's brain, how they shrink in size is different depending on people to people. So autistic people, they have a lot of wrinkles in their brain, and also their lungs also is also folded up, and also their guts as well. So the autistic children will have difficulty breathing, or their intestines also may be weak. So this is just hypothetical. So maybe in their DNA, there is something, well, not something that makes them smarter, but there is something in their DNA that makes all their body parts shrink and fold, and their minds fold, and all the other parts fold up. So it's like in a building. If something that should be shrunken, if you try to shrink down a building and fold it up, you can't just fold up one part in a corner. Everything will fold up. So what happens if you just tweak the DNA still isn't really understood well. You can't predict what actually happens.
So maybe I'll, in a moment, show my first slide, which is relevant to the conversations. So we're talking about DNA and whether it's transferred from generation to generation, or whether you can engineer it. And given my work in microbiology, I have been thinking a lot about whether or not we're exchanging DNA with the people that we spend time with, which is another form of engineering our DNA when you think about who you choose to be in community with. For 3 years, I skated on a roller derby league. I don't know if roller derby is something that is done in Tokyo. Are you familiar with this concept? It's a full contact sport that women are playing around the world, and I was skating for 10 hours every week and crashing into these women that were on my team for 10 hours a week. And while I was skating, I was wondering, am I engineering my microbiome by sharing this DNA with the people that I spend time with? And so in order to investigate this possibility, I worked with a number of students at the University of Oregon. If you want to get young people interested in microbiology, a great way to do it is to combine it with a study of surrounding the sport of roller derby. So what we did was we were interested in whether or not women that were on the same team together, did they share more of their microbial DNA than women that are on different teams? And then once you bring them together in a bout, do they exchange DNA? So we swabbed the arms of women in a tournament, and we took the DNA that we sampled from their arms and brought it back to the lab. And then we went through the laboratory process of being able to extract the DNA from the cells, and then we sequenced that DNA. And what we found was that, indeed, if you play on the same sports team with somebody, you share more DNA with them than if you are on a distinct team. And we also found that if you come together and do this game it's called a bout, and you come into close contact with people, then you are very likely to also exchange your DNA. So this relates to the question of at what different scales are we engineering and our DNA? And this is one model of synthetic ecology that has to do with the choice of our life, of our lifestyle and who we spend time with.
Can you tell what does it mean to share the DNA?
So right now, we all have the DNA of our microorganisms on our skin, and we also have a microbial cloud that is coming off of our body. So when you come close to people, and especially when you touch them, your microbial DNA, the DNA of your bacteria and fungi on your body, is exchanged with the people that you spend time with.
May I just comment? I think this is a great example because it's not the DNA that is being shared; it's the microbial biome.
But it's
DNA is only part of it. I really, this focus on DNA as if this is all and everything is something that I find extremely problematic because it's really decontextualizing. Going back to the idea of nature, I think the problem with nature is because it's not such a precise definition. But you talk about ecologies, and ecologies are more than just the DNA. It's interaction between those different organisms. The decontextualization of actually focusing on just one molecule as if this is everything is something that I find extremely problematic, and it really changes the way we think about the world around us.
I was just trying to simplify the language right here in this context.
Exactly.
But I agree.
But the constant reference to DNA as if it's some kind of a magical molecule that it stands for, it's becoming a religious metaphor.
I understand that microorganisms are much more than just their DNA.
Thank you.
It's the answer to the whole. It's the answer
Any comment
to the whole.
on Joy?
Well, it's the answer to the whole thing. It's very complicated.
Exactly. but we need to we need to conclude the fact that
I think the metaphor that is the closest is actually culture.
Yes.
Because whether you're talking about the self-driving cars and machine learning, or whether we're talking about the microbial system as a system, we're bringing not only DNA, but our whole history, and then we're sending it into the future. And like you're saying, as we interact, as you come to Japan and have this conversation, it infects the rest of Japan, and you'll be leaving traces of your ideas and traces of your biome and many other things here. But there's actually, Tony and Fiona that were at RCA, they're designers. They do interesting design fiction. One of their design fictions, one of their students' projects is the idea that in the future, when you have self-driving cars, each country car will be different. And so when you import cars from India to the US, they have to be retrained. But it's probably true, actually. And I think what's interesting is that really the culture metaphor, I think, works very well. And you could maybe replace nature with a certain version of culture, because culture is very dynamic in the way that we look at it.
But again, I think to some extent my interest is the context. And it seems that the current discussion around contemporary biology always strives towards decontextualizing. There's one of the examples I really like to use is things like the Frozen Ark, which is a collection that natural history museums and zoos around the world are now collecting DNA and even stem cells of animals that are about to go extinct as a kind of insurance policy. Now this is kind of a really interesting proposition, because it basically means that in our eyes we say we don't mind that the panda would be extinct because we have the potential of bringing it back. Now the panda is going extinct not because the DNA is disappearing, but because the environment in which it operates is disappearing. So the notion that the DNA of the panda is really enough for us to feel good about ourselves, that there is a potential of preservation, is exactly the problem that I constantly see with this focus on DNA as if it's the central thing and the central dogma. And again, this idea of being able to manipulate DNA and think that it's going to stick, although I appreciate that you're very much aware that it's not going to stick and it's going to change and evolve over time, so we need to follow it up. It constantly has to be coupled with the context and the environment.
That sounds like ecology.
Exactly, yes.
Right.
The Oron was mentioning about the interesting relation between nature and man-made. Would you a little bit mention about it?
You want me to tell the story? I can.
Not a long one, but.
Yeah, it's a long story, but I won't tell all of it. But there's, you know, from my perspective, I was focusing with my work on the level above DNA, and that's cells and tissues. And this is something that I was very interested because, in a sense, if you think about life, and let's maybe move the discussion from nature to life, which is another, you know, very complex idea, and no one seems to agree about the definition of what life is, but let's say that within the room, people would have a better idea what life is than DNA or nature. So the interesting thing with, if you think about life, there is one level that's below it. When it stops to exist, it doesn't die. Yeah. So cell is, when cell stops to exist, you can say that the cell died. When DNA stops operating, you don't really talk about it in those terms. So I was always interested in that, and I was interested in that within kind of our relationship to life and our understanding of life is shifting and changing when we start to take that and put it within different context. But then, especially after the Craig Venter thing, I became more interested in the milieu, in the operational environment in which this thing operates. So I went to Lapland because I was very interested in finding a substrate that, in my perspective, would be something that never had life on it, and try to grow life on it and see how life operates within something like that. For me, in my eyes, Lapland was a place of ice and rocks, that life doesn't exist. But I arrived there in September, and it was just after the growth season. And there was so much life around it that I couldn't relate to it, because there was too much. There were berries and mushrooms and reindeers, and I could actually survive. I'm from Australia. If I go to the bush, I would die after 3 days. If I go to Lapland in September, I can survive for a few weeks, just eating from there. So I couldn't connect, and I couldn't find what I was looking for. And then I found a crash site of a German plane from 1942, and in this crash site, there was a small piece of perspex. Now, the interesting thing about that is that it reminded me, when I was studying biomaterials, that the history of synthetic biomaterials was that when, for the very first time, they used perspex for the canopies of cockpits of planes, and when pilot crashed and those shrapnels from the perspex got into the body, there was no rejection. So they came back from war, and surgeons realized that actually here's a synthetic material that is compatible with the body. And that was the birth of synthetic biomaterials that led to the birth of regenerative medicine and tissue engineering and all of those kind of approaches. And the strange thing for me was to go all the way to the most remote place I've ever been to in my life, to the wilderness, to look for this proto-substrate and find this piece of plastic, which was what I was looking for at the very first place. So it kind of, you know, put me within this interesting position of actually realizing that nature doesn't exist.
Any comment?
Well, life. Involves DNA, and they carry information. Why does DNA be handed over from one generation to another, and with the mixture of man and woman? What's the significance of that? What is the meaning of that? Mystifies me, because the fact that you're living is a big matter for an individual. But in a way, we are just the media of carrying one DNA to another, from one generation to another. So it's just a matter of information being passed on from one to another. So it's just the blueprint of that information being carried over. So we're just a mechanism. What's it for? I think there are many layers, as I said earlier. And DNA, when it was discovered, was believed to explain everything. But actually, this is just like an architectural movement. It shifts. DNA mutates, and through a virus, it will be modified, and through the environment, the way it moves will change as well. So if you just focus on DNA, it's just like looking at the form, shape of the building, trying to have that explain the whole culture of that city. So that's too simplistic. Of course, to understand better about your body, we are doing the DNA sequencing and others, but we are looking at something else as well. For example, protein. The smell is the easiest example. Many complex proteins are used for the inter-cell communication, be it microbes or protein. Microbes, DNA, they are all proteins. But we are only using, or we only have a limited understanding of the proteins that we use and limited view of that. And there are many different types of brain cells. And we have yet to identify all of those different types. And if you just look at one single neural system, they all are different as well. And when you look inside, the inside are different as well. To give you one example, we are trying to map the human brain. But it's just like having just a map of a road and trying to understand the city without really knowing what each drivers are thinking. So it's too simplistic. And at our lab, we have this project in which we look at the each molecular layer of the proteins, trying to do the analysis. We're talking about lots of data. And even when we elucidate at that level, we may find something more behind it. So what we are now finding is that there are so many things that we're not finding. And back in 2003, when human genomes were sequenced, people thought that we will be able to understand everything. What we really learned is that there were things that we learned, but the conclusion was there are so many things that we don't know. So we are using various tricks for cancer treatment, and medical thinking are evolving. But when it comes to human bodies or nature, I think they are getting far and far away from us each year. We often talk about singularity. Back in 1940s, computers will have infinite knowledge and we can understand everything. There was that optimism. But I know that that's just impossible because today, the more we do the research, we study, the true understanding gets away from us. So that's what we know that is more complex than we think.
So as we were saying, let's say that DNA is an architecture, but surrounding the architecture, there are the lives of human people, living people. It can be an environment, as Jessica said. It can be called ecology as well. And from Oron's perspective, it can be called context. There are diverse people living around those DNAs of architectures, and they are generating diverse cultures, and that also defines and determines the meanings of a DNA. Well, it is certainly true that the DNA was one of the things that we needed to understand. Likewise, architecture, we need to understand architecture, otherwise urban cities cannot exist, but it's not suffice alone. And Bruno Latour was mentioned by Oron. And he's a very interesting philosopher. He says that science and technology themselves are completely politicized. And what everyone believes becomes the fact, considered and recognized as being the fact. And once everybody recognizes it, the scientific people, scientists say that it was determined by the nature. But science and technology are almost like a religion. It may sound weird, but that's the way. So we are trying to understand, and we understand in a certain way, and we impose our way of understanding onto people, urban cities. So it's almost like a religious faith, and it is ever accelerating along with the acceleration of the evolution of the science and technology. And gene dive is one of the technologies I've mentioned, looking into the genes of the bugs. The speed of invention of that type of technology is ever more accelerating. So it is similar to faith, religious faith, and it is more dangerous, perhaps, or equally dangerous. So science and technology and culture, how to hit the right balance between them is the point in order to have a discussion with all to discuss about what is right to do, what is wrong to do. And more than half of the US population doesn't believe in the evolution by Darwin. There are more US citizens who believe in the angels' existence than the Darwinism. So we cannot talk to those people about the science technology. So it is not possible at all to let the population make a decision, but who else make a decision? That's very, very difficult. Yes, so science technology can be impacted by culture because it can be similar to faith, religious faith.
There's a term that I borrowed from the psychology of gambling, which is called illusions of control. And I would claim that a lot of what we see, especially in the context of synthetic biology, comes from the same mindset of the illusions of control. So when you go to the casino, you think you can control the fate of your gambling by either rituals or by understanding a system or doing all of that, while knowing all too well that actually the whole system is skewed against you, it's biased against you. But you still have this belief that you might be able to control it, to control the outcomes. And synthetic biology at this stage at the moment with our knowledge is exactly like that. So it's not so much religion, it's more gambling.
And I think about these illusions of control a lot. I know I keep talking about microorganisms, but it's what I spend the bulk of my time thinking about right now. And I've been paying attention to being in Tokyo and my experience here versus being in San Francisco, where I spend a lot of time, and talking to people and watching people and their perception of the built environment and the city, and whether we're in a clean, sterile environment versus not. And I think it is science and technology that led us to believe that it's possible to be in a space that is free of microbes in a sterile indoor environment. And what I'm wondering about is what needs to change culturally so that people understand that we're actually in this wild ecosystem indoors, and that we're sharing our ecosystem with one another, even though we can't see it. And I think it's going to vary how soon that is adopted from culture to culture.
I'm going back to one of the previous topics. I met with someone who studied medicines in Tibet and who came back. He told me that when people produce drugs and medicines in Tibet, all of the village residents come out of the home and they mix the ingredients of the drugs and overnight. And overnight, on the following morning, there are drugs tablets. And this has been exposed to moonlight, and this is called a moon something drug, and it is supposedly effective for your gastric problems, for your stomach. And I was having slight problems with my stomach. I asked him if it was really effective as drug, and he said yes. And someone else asked him the question: is it like as effective as in the same manner as drugs that pharmaceutically produced? And he asked back a question: what is the effectiveness? This drug is effective because people share the time and spend time together to produce it. Do you think that drugs which are produced scientifically and pharmaceutically is really effective? It may be not effective at all. You just believe it. Well, Herm Benson, one of the Harvard University's faculty, wrote a relaxation response, a book. And in this book, he went to Tibet to study about medicines, medical practices there. And Dalai Lama said that with the settings that he suggested, the analysis cannot be possible because the chemicals in the drug are tiny part of the whole drugs. What matters is if there is a belief into the drugs by the person who takes it, and also on the trust relationship between the doctor, physician, and the patient. And it is called placebo in the Western terminology. And placebo is, and the clinical trials are designed in such a manner that there is a placebo as a pure control with no effectiveness at all. So in the U.S. thinking, placebo is completely a noise, but it is the drug which is effective in Tibet. So it's really the belief, and it's almost like a religion. So it's a psychology of the human which make the effectiveness work. So that person that I mentioned is in an very much opposition to the Japanese physicians community, I heard, and he published a book as well. So it is supposed that scientific science has to be proven. All the same experiences under the same conditions have to regenerate the same result, but it is not really the case. So in the US, the scientists have just now started to realize personalized medicine has been suggested recently by President Obama. So the treatment must be personalized. That's accepted already. And now the remaining question is, does the patient can be open to and psychologically open? That can also have an impact on the effectiveness of cancer treatment that is now being started to be shown by some scientific data. But beyond that, the solution cannot be brought about by the existing methodology of the big pharma companies. Hiroaki Kitano of the Sony Corporation has talked about a very complex way of thinking, technology which allows to analyze into traditional Chinese medicine. So there are some interesting moves. One of the most interesting moves currently is in the U.S., we observed that the predefined protocol and what your doctor tells you actually are different. So I always ask a doctor, what is the determined protocol and what is your own advice? They're always different from each other. So there are scientific evidences and what doctors think good for their patients. There is a gap currently, and that is becoming a large problem.
So we have about 10 minutes left. Are there any questions from the floor? We might take this opportunity to take questions from the floor. Anything? No questions? Toward the back and right.
Thank you. My name is Sunil Dubey from Metropolis Word Association, and I also teach Oron at University of Sydney. So my question is to you. You mentioned illusion of control, and when we look at the recent urbanization, it's quite evident what's happening and how much catch-up we have to do all around the world. We have over 200 member cities who work with us closely, from developed, developing, and in transition city. And one of the biggest challenge we are seeing in urbanization is there's a lot of work happening in science and technology. But when we see the pattern, when we see what's happening in terms of poors migrating to cities, livelihood there, and the standard of living, it seems to be declining if you look at a global scale. How do you think science and technology can bring some rapid intervention in improving the lives of cities around the world? And I also want to say, I agree as an academic, your comment about the DNA. We are putting too much focus on that without realizing that is something we are creating, which we, if not given a proper emphasis, might even backfire on all of us. And it's historically, it has proven that humans are capable of doing that. So, quick question to you, Oron. Thank you.
Thank you. You know, it's a great question, and it's kind of funny that you ask me because I'm an artist. You know, I'm not going to give you an answer about how science and technology is going to save us. It's interesting when the survey at the beginning, at the first day, about the importance, most people actually voted for culture rather than science and technology as a way to improving cities. Now, I might have something quite political to tell you here, but I know that social science and humanities departments in universities here in Tokyo are shutting down following a government decree. I think that's way worse than investing billions of dollars in science. I think the quality of life is not just determined by the quality of the science and technology in the society, it's way beyond that. And it goes back to the idea that the context is much more important than the little bits of information that we might be able to pick up and decontextualize them. And going back to the idea of the illusions of control, we have to remember that humans are irrational. So any attempt of trying to make our society scientific is going to hit a wall time and time again because we don't behave as a society, as a culture, as humans, in the way that would be predicted as if we were rational beings. So we need to acknowledge that, we need to be open to that, and we need to somehow create our societies to accommodate that.
Oron-san, what do you think? I mean, kind of dead end by science. What is the answer, or how you solve it? By art or by religion?
I'm a materialist myself, I must admit, and it's kind of an interesting thing for me to advocate for something which is irrational, because I would like to see myself as, like most of us, I suppose, in the room, as a product of scientific knowledge. You know, I don't believe in deities, I don't believe in angels, but I still believe that we need to acknowledge the fact that, especially when it comes to one of the most important decisions that we as a society are going to make, and that's the decisions we're going to make in regard to how we're going to treat life, that we need to acknowledge that life is special. And maybe just because that we are living beings ourselves. And what we choose to do to life in any level, we'll end up doing to ourselves. And there's enough historical references and historical precedents that warn us against it. So we need to remember that as well.
But you didn't answer to my question.
I think art is much better in making meaning than science. I think religious, to a large extent, is irrelevant because I don't think this is something that is going to save us. But I think that we need to have some kind of another level of understanding of how we operate in the world, which is beyond the simply Western reductionist view of kind of the way the world operates. So art would be the way out.
So I don't know how many of you were here for the first day, but I showed a cycle where you had art creating perceptions that then inform science, that creates utility through engineering, that creates society through design, that informs art. And I think that it's a cycle. And I think that science is one piece, and art can inform science, and science informs engineering, and engineering informs design, and design informs art. So I think that if that's flowing, and I think the problem with education, like in Japan and many other places, is they're separated. And the scientists are just talking to other scientists, and the artists are just talking to the artists. And I think that what we need is communication, but also more people like you who understand science that are also artists, or understand engineering and science and design. And I think that's I think how you get
Very
around
important,
it.
Yeah.
We need more symbioticas.
Yeah.
So I took the approach of marrying an artist, Steve Green. He's an illustrator, and because I work with invisible biology, it's fantastic because he creates art based on the science that I do, and it does help me understand my science better. So I can't imagine making advances professionally without having a science-art connection.
I understand that you brought a small book, which was by illustration.
Yes.
By your...
Yes, my husband Steve Green made those illustrations, yes.
Okay, もう一つ質問を取りましょう。
Well, let's take another question from the floor. Yes, toward the front here, in the second row.
Hi, I have a question. So culture in Japanese is bunka. Bunka is word and turning into words. So the importance of I guess culture is to turning things into words. And I think the word bunka in Japanese was born in like Meiji era, like 1868 to 1910 or something like that. So that's when the Western cultures came in, and then Japanese realized it's important to put words into this idea of culture. So I guess my question is, how do you kind of see the importance of turning ideas into words, and how that create that, social transitions and movements?
To whom you're asking?
To everyone, or anyone who might
Just
be.
one or two.
Yeah.
Please choose. Huh?
So I guess the question is like the importance of turning ideas into words, or making invisible into visible.
じゃあ、伊藤さん。
So I think words are just like DNA. I think they're reductionists, and you can put a lot of things in books, but words can't describe music. They can't. There's so many things they can't describe. So I'm actually maybe I have a bias because I don't like words, and I don't think in words. So the reason when the words come out depending on who I'm talking to, but I think in ideas, which I think are important. And so I think that there is a tyranny of words, and even words like nature, we spend a lot of time talking about that, but or God means something different for everyone. So I think I think words again are important, like DNA and like architecture, but I think it misses a huge part of. So in a funny way, the word culture, bunka, I think is limits the way we think about what culture really is.
Yeah, I suppose one have to remember that language is a technology. Yeah, so like any other technology, it's both, and again going back to Latour was talking about those inscription devices, that we see the world through the tools we have. So if we are confined by language, we're confined to a very limited, and I totally agree with you, that it is a very constraining way of engaging with the world, and we need to find other ways to be able to broaden our perspective and find new technologies of both communication and exchange of ideas that go beyond the limits of this very specific technology.
And I would say that I'm a scientist because it brings me joy, and it's important for me to express my work through words, through art, and through sound, and through video. And so I think that all of those, and ideas as well, but all of those different media are valuable for getting clarity on what it is that you're working on.
Hi.
Okay. We're going in all directions. But ultimately, who we are is a question, and how do we live in this environment is the question, I think. And Shinichi Fukuoka, who is not here, wrote a book entitled What is Life? And he says that life is the equation, the dynamic equilibrium, he says. It's not static, it is dynamic, and yet it is in equilibrium. And he says that human bodies, of course, we all know that human bodies see the enormous amount of replacement of cells. So if you put markers on the food that you consume, in about 2 days, it will be all over your body. And that's how humans preserve our life, our body. But cells are being copied with DNA blueprint. So it is regenerated, but there'll be misprints as we go on. So there'll be bad parts, defective parts, and it will go into entropy, into enthalpy. Will go into death. In other words, time catches up, he says. And then there'll be cancer, maybe. some kind of problem with your body, and that kills your whole body eventually. So the fact that you are living is really reliant on this very nuanced, very fragile equilibrium. And I think all humans are like that. Very interesting. And in that context, how are we going to create culture? How are we going to enjoy this finite time? And I think that will relate to the value of living a life. And that's why culture is important. And to create that kind of environment, I think, is the responsibility that we all have to assume. Now it is time to end this session. Thank you very much for your participation.